Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the fifth of 8 of the Energy Symposium webinars hosted by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Center for Energy and Power. The purpose of these events is to present topic-specific information to the Alaska Energy Security Task Force as they work to develop a statewide energy plan. If you missed the first 4 webinars, the recordings are available via the link on the task force website. Today's presentation is Alaska Energy Statistics and Economics. My name is Brittany Smart, and I am the Energy Transitions Initiatives Coordinator at ASAP, and I will be facilitating the presentations this morning. We are joined today by Mr. Steve Colt, Research Faculty at ASAP, Mr. Nolan Clouda, Executive Director at the UA Center for Economic Development, Ms. Laura Vaught, who's the Project Manager out of the Commissioner's Office of the Alaska Department of Commerce, Community, and Economic Development. Each presentation is allotted 40 minutes, which includes the 10 minutes for questions and answers. As these presentations are intended to inform the task force, only task force members will be called on to verbally ask questions by raising their virtual hand. All webinar attendees will be able to submit questions through the Q&A box on your webinar screen. However, please note that we will again be prioritizing questions from task force members. Today's meeting is being recorded and the presentation slide decks will be available on the Alaska Energy Authority website. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce the first topic, energy data, the good, the bad, and the missing, presented by Mr. Steve Colt. Steve has worked with ASAP and energy data for a number of years, and recently he's been helping develop an updated Alaska energy statistics. The report was last updated 10 years ago. And Steve, thank you for joining us today. And it's more than just a report, it's also worksheets and whatnot. There's a lot of work that went into that. So Steve, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brittany. How's my sound?
Coming in nice and clear. Go ahead, sir.
All right. Well, it's a great privilege to be here. I'm sorry I could not attend the task force meeting of last Tuesday, August 8th, at which the Alaska Energy Statistics enterprise was explained, I'm sure, very well by my colleagues Gwen Holdman, Sarah Goad, and others, Sarah Fisher-Goad, excuse me, and others. And we could characterize that as the view from the top with respect to energy statistics and what's in them and what they might be used for. This morning, I'm going to give basically a 2-part presentation that tries to explain or explore or just share some of the nitty-gritty details and honestly frustrations that people who work with data in energy data in Alaska have faced and are grappling with, and hopefully raise some or elevate some issues and questions for the task force's consideration, especially the Energy Data Subcommittee. So next slide, please. Here's a quick outline of what I'm going to try to cover. And at the outset, I want to make clear that we're really focusing in line with today's topic relating to economics and the importance of energy to our economy and our well-being. I'm really focusing on what I call mesoscale data relating to buildings, communities, regions, and at monthly and annual timescales. There are, of course, now terabytes or petabytes of data coming in related to engineering performance of projects, utility grid status, you name it. But we're not really talking about that. I'm kind of an old-fashioned Luddite, and I'm still dealing with these mesoscale data, and that's what I'm going to talk about, and that's what energy statistics covers. So I'm going to share with you some really mundane, perhaps, or perhaps fascinating vignettes or case studies that have come up in the process of trying to reboot Alaska Energy Statistics after a 10-year hiatus. And if you find this boring, you could check out for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and come back. But you might not find it boring. I certainly don't. And after we do that, I'm going to briefly talk about the big elephants in the room of data, namely heat and transportation. And then I have just one slide with some final thoughts to end with, hopefully with time for questions and discussion. Next slide, please. So here's the first vignette. It relates to diesel electricity generation in Southeast as it appeared or appears in Alaska Energy Statistics. Next slide. All right, what's wrong with this picture? I don't think, Brittany, we want to, even if you're technically capable of actually soliciting responses. So unfortunately, you're going to have to pretend to answer and see if you are right. What's wrong with this picture of electricity generation, energy by AEA region in 2014? All right, next slide. Well, here's what's wrong with this picture. We have a negative 243,000 megawatt hours showing up as the oil-fired generation in the Southeast Alaska region in 2014. That's a problem, but there it is. And this is how the data appeared when I started working with it. Problems like this, it's not about me. Problems like this could have appeared to many other people, and I think they do, as many other people besides me grapple with trying to digest and clean the raw data that we get. Next slide. So how can we solve the problem? Well, we have to kind of work backwards through the data delivery chain. And the first place to go is from the aggregated regional data table in energy statistics to the granular plant by plant, power plants, plant by plant data in table 2.3 of the Energy Statistics Excel workbook. And here we find that the entire source of the problem appears to be the Southwest Bailey power plant down in Ketchikan. You might say, well, there's negative signs below it, but those are normal negative signs of power plants that require electricity in order to essentially remain available to generate if needed. But negative 262 plus megawatt, 262,000 megawatt hours at the Southwest Bailey plant is just not right, and it is the source of our problem. So where did that come from? Well, now we can go one step further back to the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, to their Form 923 database, which thankfully, and I commend the EIA for the work they've been doing over decades to make data transparent and available. And so thankfully, you can very quickly go to the web, right back to the EIA's Form 923 data. So this screenshot, the second one, is from the EIA's website, not from ACEP's. And you can see here that we've got the big negative generation is being reported by the EIA itself. And with a little further digging, we can even go back to the data form that utilities are required by law to fill out. And we can confirm that the EIA is asking for, I'm down in my third yellow box, that the EIA asks for data in megawatt hours. And if you fill out the spreadsheet version of their form, you see it again. But here it's pretty clear. If you go look at the capacity of the Southwest Bailey diesel power plant in Ketchikan, there's no way it can produce or consume or whatever this magnitude of megawatt hours. And it becomes pretty clear that the solution to this problem is that this one plant was reported its incidental power consumption to remain on standby. It reported those numbers in kilowatt hours, not megawatt hours. So they were off by a factor of 1,000. And I won't ask to go back to the regional slide, but the regional slide showed a big chunk of negative megawatt hours. And if you just feed that into any kind of subtotal, it would dramatically affect conclusions about what's going on with the load in Southeast. So this is an example of a major error that needed to be fixed. And I'm not trying to blame anybody at all for this thing. It's just what happens. It's the way it goes. And the challenge for all of us is to have ways of finding and correcting these kinds of glitches before they get too far down the road to be fixable as the sands of time wash over all of these data trails. Next slide. Here's another view from the energy statistics trenches. This relates to renewable generation, electricity generation in the Northwest Arctic Borough. Next slide. All right, what's wrong with this picture? This is a lot harder unless you're a real energy geek. Five, four, three, two, one. Next slide. Here's a hint. And again, I'm sorry we can't have audience participation. I'm sure several or many of you in the listening in or watching, excuse me, know that this is the Shungnak solar PV project. So the hint is Shungnak. Next slide. So this is just a repeat of what's wrong with this picture with the benefit of the hint. And I bet many of you are onto the trail here, but let's go to the next slide. Here's the problem. This is supposed to be energy generated in Shungnak in 2021, and it's showing 16 megawatt hours of wind, but 0 of solar. You might ask how I stumbled onto this problem, and the answer is it was almost random. But I think knowing about the great success of the Shungnak project, I was kind of interested to see how it would show up in energy statistics, and lo and behold, it doesn't. Next slide. So going down the trail of bad data or questionable data, the first thing that I did was compared the generation table in energy stats to the installed capacity table, which is also available at the power plant level. And here we see an exact reversal. I won't ask you to toggle, Laura, unless you can do it really fast. But oh, she's going to take up the challenge. Go ahead and go backwards. Wind versus solar reported energy output, and toggle forwards again. Wind versus solar reported installed capacity. So they can't both be right. And of course, my gut feeling is that the solar capacity is right and the energy should be showing up as solar energy. But I went to check that to the next step in the bad data trail, which is on the next slide. And this is trying to look back at the raw data feed, if you will, from PCE monthly data provided by the Alaska Energy Authority, because they pay out the PCE. They write the PCE checks and they collect the monthly PCE operational statistics. And here we see, here I was hoping that I would see solar here, which would kind of end the story and confirm what's going on. But instead we see wind reported, which I guess explains why it shows up in the generation table as wind and not solar. So this is a little bit of a head scratcher. What else can we do? Well, the next thing I did, which I think is on the next slide, is to plot. When in doubt, plot your data. So here's a little plot of the Shungnak numbers in the yellow box. And here's where I went briefly astray. I jumped to the conclusion that, oh, this looks like a wind plant that comes on strong in the winter, months 9 through 12. But it didn't take long for me to come to my senses and remember, if you look at the next slide, please, that in fact, the PCE data are all reported on fiscal year and fiscal month bases. So the raw data in the PCE database says that it's month 3 of fiscal year 2022, when in fact, following the Julian calendar, it's September is month 3. It's really September of 2021. So if we get our bearings on the plot, it now becomes, I think, crystal clear that we're looking at the profile of a solar installation's output, dropping to 0 in the middle of the winter and coming on strong in May and June. And there are no data yet for July and August. So that's another example of where we run into these glitches, and I'm not even going to address. I leave it to all of you to ponder. Go ahead with the next slide. I leave it to all of you to ponder a question. Well, it'll be in my slide, but whose responsibility is it, or should it be, to make the necessary changes based on what we've learned? I will make some changes to Alaska Energy Statistics. I don't know who, if anyone, at AEA may make changes to their data. This seems to me like a question worthy of some thought. All right, moving right along, another little vignette. For those of you who tuned in last Tuesday, this is one of the slides which was shown as a output of the energy statistics enterprise, namely a 10-year time trend combining net generation information with energy sales and potentially providing some interesting insights into how things are evolving on the rail belt. The purpose of this vignette is just to, again, from the trenches, next slide, indicate that these graphs are not so simple to produce under our current energy data system. So this one, for example, requires cutting and pasting of 10 separate Excel data panels from one table, and it also required cutting and pasting 10 other data panels from an entirely different table that shows sales. So it actually was, or it is, quite tedious for an analyst who wants to do trend analysis to work with our existing energy statistics framework, which is heavily oriented towards snapshots year by year, looking at the cross-section of communities and power plants. This isn't just an Alaska issue. It also shows up when you go to other data sources like the Energy Information Administration itself. The EIA data is served up one zip file per year, and it's essentially up to you to trendify it on your own. Let's go to the next slide. Now we do, I guess it's a combination of did and still do, have a data processing platform called the Alaska Energy Data Gateway that somewhat took the tedium out of creating trends. But I gave up after half an hour trying to generate that graph you just saw using the Gateway platform, which still exists. It's just very out of date. And I'll just leave it by saying that A, it's out of date, and B, even the Gateway in its heyday was not very good at generating trends if you wanted to aggregate over any number of power plants to create some kind of regional total or a statewide total or what have you. So the AEDG, I'm sure, will be discussed by the data subcommittee of the task force and others, and I don't want to say anything more about it today. Next slide. And here's a final bonus view from the statistical trenches. Where's rooftop solar in Alaska Energy Statistics? Well, that's a really good question that I think we're still grappling with how to answer it. Next slide. If you came last week, you saw rooftop solar, affectionately known as BTM or behind the meter solar, included in this graph. And in fact, it really stands out to me as the source that's growing right now. And this yellow bar for 2021 solar does include utility solar, but almost all of that bar is rooftop behind the meter solar. And that's the source that really grew in the past 10 years on the rail belt for renewables after we stopped adding wind in about 2013. So it's important. And it does not make its way into energy statistics through the standard channels. Nobody reports BTM solar to the EIA, and it doesn't reach us through that channel. So how did it get into this graph? Next slide. Well, it got into this graph because, it got into that chart because we actually do have compiled data on rooftop behind the meter solar. Last week, Gwen Holdman probably had this bland quote that it's compiled by the ASAP Solar Technologies program, but let's get real. Who actually did this? Next slide. Well, my colleague Chris Pike did it. He did it as a labor of love that he's been carrying out for about 10 years now. And if it weren't for Chris, we wouldn't be able to draw this graph, at least not without a lot more work. All right, on we go. I've got 4 minutes. I will leave these takeaways for you to read on your own. There's nothing to be gained by me reading them. Next slide. In the very few minutes we have remaining, I want to touch on what I think is really more important than everything I just said as we look forward. So what about heat? Next slide. Well, on the heat front, we've made some tremendous progress in the last 2 years with the making public, essentially, the Alaska Retrofit Information System, or ARIS, data collected and curated by AHFC. 3 cheers to them. This is a great data set, in particular because it provides data at the household level, which is critical for good policy because there's so much variability in what people actually do and how they use energy that it's very dangerous to operate based on the typical household or the typical house. Next slide. However, I cannot help but remind everybody, I have to remind myself of this often, that the ARIS data on building energy consumption is mostly modeled estimates. It's a good model. It's a good faith attempt to put inputs into the model. But nonetheless, what you see in ARIS for energy consumption is modeled estimates. It's not actually measured data. Next slide. And so that's what's missing with heat. We have almost 0 directly metered data for fuel oil consumption, and we have no easy or fast way to get individual gas meter data, although it certainly exists. Next slide. What about transportation? And I am winding down here, so next slide. Well, first of all, one of the neat things you can learn is the electric vehicle count in Alaska, but you can only learn this if you know to go to the Chugach Electric website, where they've been, I don't know, kind or generous enough to compile the data for us over the years. It's an example of data nuggets that are sort of hiding. You have to know where to go to find them. Next slide. More to the point, or more important, looking ahead, next slide. What might happen to our electric load if we have widespread adoption of EVs and heat pumps? Well, ASAP is looking at this question, and we are looking at scenarios where there might be 70 to 90% adoption of EVs by 2050. If you dig into this slide visually, you can see that in fact our growth trajectories are not so crazy in comparison to other regions who typically only model out through 2030. But I'll just leave it at that. We may be crazy, but if we're crazy with this scenario, other regions seem to be equally crazy. So what are the implications of this kind of adoption? Next slide. Well, here's a beautiful graph produced by my ASAP colleagues showing region by region. This is not a stacked chart. Region by region, what the load might be throughout the year with 90% electric vehicle adoption. So For example, the blue bars show at the left of the graph that in the winter, we might see 600 to 700 megawatts of power demanded by the EV fleet in the central, which is Chugach and MEA region. That's a lot of power. But how can we put this in context? Here's an example of, and again, no fault of anyone, but it's not easy to find data like this and to put it into context. So at this point, I was running out of time making these slides. And if you go to the next one, we'll skip the heat pump analogy here. Equally big loads could come from heat pumps, but go ahead. As I ran out of time, I grabbed at a NREL report that I knew existed to see, well, what's the winter peak load of the rail belt these days? Because that's a hard number to find since it involves adding up 4 or 5 different utilities. Anyway, that peak load is about 740 megawatts. And now I didn't have time to do the math and make a plot, so you guys all have to do the math yourself. But it's not too hard to come up with the conclusion that just from EV adoption, never mind the heat pumps, we could see the load double or triple on the rail belt. And this is a good segue into our next 2 speakers, and also ties in with a theme of Gwen Holdman's and others, that perhaps the best or only path to truly cheap power is to vastly increase the energy production and spread our fixed costs over 2 or 3 times as many kilowatt hours. Last slide. I'll let you read this one on your own, but I will highlight the last bullet, which is, I think, an important question for the good people on this task force and the energy data subcommittee to really take on. Is energy data a useful byproduct of programs that are administered for other purposes, or should it be a primary outcome that we expect out of certain programs and processes? So that's it. If we have time now, we can have questions and discussions. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your presentation there. As a reminder, for those of you that are on the task force, feel free to raise your hand if you would like to ask a question verbally. Anyone can ask a question in the Q&A chat box. I'm not seeing any right now, so we'll get the conversation started here real quick, Steve. So you kind of touched on this at the end of your presentation. So why is having this data important? Why is it important that we understand where the power is coming from, what's getting generated, and what the needs are?
Well, I think different people are going to have different answers to that question, but the stock answer is you can't manage what you don't measure, and that is particularly true as we start to grapple with the heat and transportation energy challenges. And one could even argue, I think, in fact, I will go out on a limb and say this, we may have over-focused on electricity over the past 30 years simply because it is so well measured. Now that's a hypothesis or a proposition, but that people can react to individually. But like it or not, all of the energy consumption streams are going to be increasingly merged as beneficial electrification takes hold, and we have more and more demand placed on our power grid to supply not only traditional electric power needs, but also electrified heat and electrified transportation. So I think the question, I was thinking about this last night, if we just sit around and do nothing, or basically do business as usual and keep focusing on what's easily measured in the electric realm, we will see the transportation and heat data start to emerge as electricity consumption data. But wouldn't it be better to be proactive about knowing what's out there in the realm of heat and transportation, so we can guide the transition from non-electrified heat and transportation toward more electrified heat and transportation? That's my answer to that question, but it's a big question, and it requires a lot more thought, because data collection is expensive, it is tedious, it is time consuming, and we ought to know why we're collecting the particular data that we choose to invest in collecting.
So building on that point, you just talked about data collection. In order to, you want to collect what's usable, right? So can you speak a little bit about the level of effort that it took to update the Alaska energy statistics, and maybe some of the challenges with the form that the data was coming in at? You noted in your slides that there was some information that was coming in through PDFs versus Excel spreadsheets, and kind of what that level of effort looks like and why that format is important.
I'll give it a shot. That's a huge question. I did allude, in a kind of a snarky bullet, to the idea that much of our data, if you want to go out and find it, you'll end up cutting and pasting rasters from a scanned PDF, which is probably not where we want to be, but it is the reality in many realms. So it takes a lot of effort to make a quality energy statistics data set. And rather than recapitulate efforts that myself and others are doing right now, I would just like to give a long overdue shout out to the person who did it at the Alaska Power Authority. Penny Haldane was her name, and I believe she worked half-time around the year or something like that. Back in the days before the internet, yes, but really facing the same fundamental issues of getting data from the EIA and from the PCE program, and making sure that it didn't have big glitches in it, like the one we explored with the negative 292,000 megawatt hours in Ketchikan. So Penny was a superstar, in my opinion, and her level of effort is indicative of what it probably would take to generate good quality energy statistics. I think you also asked about formats, and here's where I really have to say that my own skill set is almost completely obsolete with respect to how we could probably manage some of the incoming data. I think we have the talent in Alaska. Maybe we have to look at people under age 12 to do it, but the talent to take in the year-by-year snapshots that we get from EIA and automatically turn that into a multi-year database that could generate these trends faster than cutting and pasting from Excel workbooks. But it won't be me that does it, and it's a good example of how we could harness the talent that I know exists in data science to speed up and improve the process by which we take in the EIA data and the PCE data and make it accessible and transparent and actionable.
And then we've referenced the Alaska energy statistics a couple times now. Can you kind of talk about where we might be at on releasing the update, as it hasn't been updated in 10 years? You're working on that. When do we anticipate being that at least be out for input and comment from those working with energy data?
Sure, on that one. There are two basic products coming out of our current ASEP energy statistics effort. One is a series of, I got to do my arithmetic, 8 Excel workbooks covering the years 2014 through 2021. These were mentioned in Gwen and Sarah's presentation last week. These workbooks we hope to have available for trying to get some sort of peer review or more eyes on the data. And we hope to make those workbooks available within the next week or 2 weeks. The other data product is a report written in words and displaying graphics largely, and that we expect, or we hope to have out, but not till the end, really till the end of the year.
Well, great. Thank you so much for your time today, Steve, and for sharing your thoughts in regards to energy data, what's available, what's solid, and what is missing. So really appreciate your insight there. We're going to go ahead and move on next. We have Mr. Nolan Klauda with the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development. He's joining us today. So thank you, sir. There you are. So I got to go to my notes here just real quick. So you worked very closely with the state in the development of the comprehensive economic development strategy and worked on the background on getting the summary information needed to develop the comprehensive economic development strategy, also known as the CEDS. So today we asked you to speak a little bit about that process and from your perspective, what energy looks like across the state and how it plays into our economic strategy. And with that, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today.
All right, yes, and thanks for inviting me here, Brittany. Nolan Klauda, and I direct the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development, and I'm going to give an overview of the Alaska Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. This is a statewide economic strategic plan that was done under the direction of the Department of Commerce. The Center for Economic Development, in a contractual role, did the work of outreach, research on the background drivers for the state economy, and compiling and composing the report itself under DCCD's direction. So I'm going to give a high-level overview about the CEDS, and then Laura Vaught from DCCD is going to drill into some specific areas and give maybe more of the state departmental perspective. So what is this thing we're talking about called a CEDS? So it's a strategic plan for economic development. Usually a CEDS, it's more common that you see a CEDS developed at a local level. So the municipality of Anchorage has a CEDS, the Kenai Peninsula Borough has a CEDS, the Southwest Alaska has one, and so a statewide CEDS is actually kind of a more novel type of idea that involves kind of putting adding another sort of layer of coordination and state level thinking on top of those regional strategies, and it requires a public process. CEDS, one of the big drivers of CEDS, but I think not the sole reason to do one, is because it's necessary for certain kinds of federal funds, especially for economic development. So the U.S. Economic Development Administration is who sort of approves CEDS processes, and they provide sometimes funding to develop them. But also EDA is a large funder of economic development projects, especially infrastructure for economic development. And they don't want to fund something that isn't in a CEDS of some kind. So it's particularly important to have a CEDS together, as we have the Infrastructure Act, when we have some of these other pieces of federal legislation that are involving a lot of funding that's available. The CEDS is something that helps us to strategically utilize that as well as we can. It's a 5-year plan. This document is available on the DCCD website. I think we can share a link at some point, but it's available there to take a look at. So why do a statewide SED? So the main thinking behind it is, if we already have a lot of the state has these regional plans, but the thing is that most of our state's industries aren't localized to the Kodiak Island borough or the Kenai Peninsula borough. They span multiple parts of the state, or if not the whole state, and so it makes sense to have economic development strategies that align with that more statewide focus to meet some of the infrastructure needs that are in fact statewide. They're not all hyper localized. Promoting statewide economic growth and recovery and attracting those federal investments were some of the major reasons under consideration. And the current SEDS that was updated last year actually takes the place of a prior statewide SEDS that was developed, published in 2017. So public process behind it, there's a strategy committee. We also did an extensive review of the existing regional SEDS plans in the state to look for common threads that we can roll up to the statewide level. A lot of industry specific outreach, talking to folks that work in or that represent some of our larger industries in the state, tourism, mining, fisheries, so forth. A lot of localized outreach to different parts of the state and a survey process. And this is in addition to us doing a lot of data and background research as well. So there's a lot of kind of corralling of information that's required for a SEDS and gathering of the input. So we had a strategy committee. In fact, I think there's a few members of this task force that were on that strategy committee. It had 50 plus members. They're mostly executive leaders from business and government and the nonprofit world. 32 listening sessions around the state, a ton of these key informant interviews with key folks that it was important to get their views, and also this large employer survey. To condense what Alaska's economic position is, lots has been said about this, and I will get into some energy specific topics here in a moment, but the challenges the state economy has been facing, a lot of these are not things that are very surprising if you look on the left side, but we had to characterize the overall state of Alaska's economy. The recession, stagnation, slow recovery. Alaska's been growing economically much slower than the country as a whole. We were in a recession when much of the country was still growing in terms of employment, the declining oil and gas production, the workforce shortages we've all been hearing about, the high costs, including the high cost of energy, and regulatory hurdles to natural resource development. But on the other hand, the opportunity side of it, we do have a lot of natural resource development. The emerging sectors that we have in our state, including energy, our geographic position, and the opportunities around federal infrastructure investment. A lot of information about our state economy boiled into a couple of points here. But so getting into energy, when I was preparing this presentation, I was looking back and thinking about like how energy is really infused in a lot of different parts of this SEDS document, and it plays a lot of different roles in our state economy. And I think I boil it down to 4 main points, and you'll see these all reflected in the SEDS if you read it with an energy lens. Is that there's one is that Alaska is a major producer of energy via oil and gas, especially, right? Another is that the high energy costs in our state are a major, barrier to economic development. They are not the only barrier that we have. They are an important one though, and one that varies depending on which part of the state you're in and what energy sources are available there. But also that energy innovation is a potential source of economic opportunity. If we're talking about a lot of the companies that are forming around the energy innovation, a lot of new technologies, a lot of renewable energies, a lot of storage solutions, a lot of novel generation ideas, micro reactors. There's a ton of kind of innovation in this space in which Alaska has positioned itself as something of a test bed, and there's opportunity there. And then also that the supply of energy is a resilience challenge. We know that we're that a lot of times our supply of energy in many parts of the state is somewhat precarious, subject to natural disasters, to market disruptions that cause price spikes, to things like the Cook Inlet supply of natural gas that is finite. So energy is also a major resilience challenge to the state too. Just one example, EIA, the Energy Information Administration, although Steve Colt gave some really good examples about why this information isn't always accurate. Just you can see here, though, this is the cost difference between Alaska and the rest of the U.S. In terms of a number of different measures here. The bottom line, nothing too surprising to us, is that energy in Alaska is much more expensive than the national average. We tend to be the second, I think we're the second highest power cost state in the country, and of course we're not touching the whole subject of thermal energy, which is often an even larger share of consumption. But we looked at this type of information in the SEDS. I'm providing a little bit of more updated stuff here, but this data in the SEDS is mostly flying at a pretty high level with regard to energy. In our survey of employer organizations, we looked at what sorts of barriers respondents see for their organizations. These are mostly for-profit businesses, but also did include some nonprofits as well. Ask them to list how much of a list of barriers, how much of these are a problem for them. And the list goes longer than what you can see on the screen here. But the cost of healthcare is number one, and the cost of energy is number two. This is something that people say constrains their organization or prevents them from growing in many senses. And so energy was one of the top things that they listed, not surprisingly. We did a review. We started off doing a review of different local SEDS plans around the state. What types of goals did they mention? And I highlighted here the ones that are related to energy, and we had to develop kind of a tagging system, and these categories do overlap to some degree as well. But we had, the fourth most mentioned one was energy. So a lot of places that have their localized economic development strategies, energy is a top concern for them. You can see lower down quite a few mentions of renewable energy, power and grid, and even some of these other categories in a less obvious way have an energy component to them too. So it's a commonly listed concern for strategic planning. We did these listening sessions around the state, over 30 listening sessions, and there were 4 big takeaways from it, were these 4 things. One was that everybody was concerned about workforce shortages and gaps, a lot of concerns about housing availability. Energy costs were in there as well, and then the availability of childcare. So, not surprisingly, I had done the SEDS 5 years earlier, and energy costs were actually probably the top issue then, and still a major concern, around the state. A lot of this is shaped by rural communities that have higher costs than on the rail belt, but nonetheless, it's a factor across the board. So I want to walk you through the major SEDS goals, and this is going to give you a very high-level picture of the content that's in the SEDS. Laura is going to follow up, and she's going to talk about some of the energy-specific objectives and action items that fall under some of these. But there's 6 major goal areas in the SEDS, and what you'll see is that really energy does find itself within each of these. And I'll take these one at a time and sort of explain what they goals are, what's within them. But first is strengthening Alaska's economic engines. We use the term economic engines to talk about Alaska's kind of established, ongoing major industries. So this is where we're talking about tourism, seafood, oil and gas, mining, federal defense, forestry, not as large as it used to be, but historically a mainstay, international air cargo as well. Talked about some of the topics around the energy transition, the low carbon uses of some of our historic resources, for instance, some of the regulatory and permitting hurdles that are faced, how an energy transition, might factor in and be managed into some of these industries. There's also, we do mention things like carbon capture sequestration as well. Was it contained within the SEDS? Second was the emerging sectors, cultivate and grow our emerging sectors. So we kind of broke it out as like our legacy, major legacy industries, as well as some of these smaller emerging ones that we hope become important drivers in the future, or that are in the process of becoming important drivers. This is where we talk about mariculture, especially the farming of kelp and aquatic plants, agriculture also here, aviation, aerospace, industrial maritime, the critical mineral, the processing component of critical minerals, and manufacturing to some degree. Also, energy innovation, which gets a lot of reference in this section too. How can we be more of a test bed around renewable energy, around microgrids, around remote installations, around remote rural energy resilience. A lot of topics, a lot of that mentioned in here. Strong business climate and entrepreneurial ecosystem. This is talking about business advising and training for people starting businesses, establishing businesses, access to capital, certain regulatory barriers, e-commerce, and also marketing and promoting Alaska. This category is more energy agnostic, but if we're talking about the startup space and the entrepreneurship world, we are talking a lot about about energy related startups here. Building and updating economic foundations. And so we used economic foundations in the SEDS to be talking about the kind of underlying pieces that help make an economy function that are not necessarily tied to any one industry. So we're talking about things like general transportation infrastructure, the marine highway system, ports and harbors, airports, broadband, but we're also talking about housing, healthcare, recreational assets, all of these things that are required to some degree for people to live in a place, for an economy to function. These are sort of the bedrock pieces underneath that. And affordable energy was one of the top concerns here. Energy being one of those big barriers, the cost of energy, availability of energy being one of those barriers. So it is referenced in this section. Workforce development, we've been in this weird world of labor shortages, and this being one of the top concerns that employers are talking about everywhere. And so addressing workforce coordination, K through 12 education, higher education, voc tech, infrastructure spending, and some of the specific trades that are needed for some of the infrastructure projects that are on the way to Alaska. It's also where we talk about the remote workforce, childcare, and we did have a topic around the preparing the workforce for an energy transition. So what does it mean? If we're producing, energy in different ways than we have historically, what kind of workforce needs go along with that is one of the items addressed here. And then the last one is goal 6 is building a resilient economy. And so this is where we talk about disaster preparedness and response, the in-state capacity to produce certain kinds of goods and services where we might be dependent upon transportation linkages that could fail. The resilient infrastructure is mentioned here, and that includes things like grid and power, to the extent that sometimes redundant transmission lines might be necessary, backup sources of power, the kind of the disruptible energy supplies and how we can make them less disruptible is the key consideration here. So that's an overview of what's in the SEDS document. You can of course, Laura will have more to say about energy specific components, and I think that both of us will can be available for a Q&A. So I don't know if Brittany, if you wanted to do a separate Q&A session, or if you want to have us both combined, because we may be able to do it that way too. Your preference?
I was just thinking the same thing, because the questions that I have would really be for both of you, and I don't see anything in the chat. So Laura, I know this is a little bit earlier than we originally planned for you, but if you're good to go, thank you so much, Nolan, for your presentation here. And since we don't see any questions in, we'll go ahead and move on to Laura. And Laura is a project manager out of the Commissioner's Office for the Alaska Department of Community Commerce and Economic Development. And so with that, Laura, I believe Erica is going to be sharing the slide deck for you, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brittany. So I was asked to present today on the energy specific goals and objectives outlined in the SEDS, and I will start off by giving a background of the SEDS update process, like really high level. I know that Nolan provided a great background already, but it just sets the stage to provide the context for how the recommendations were developed, and then of course the energy specific recommendations that are of interest to this group. So next slide, please. So for background, the Alaska statewide SEDS 5-year update, which is the report that we're talking about today, it spans 2022 through 2027. That was funded by an EDA, that's the Federal Economic Development Administration, a statewide planning grant, which was one-time funding the Department of Commerce received. It originated from the ARPA Act, and so that funding came about as far as funding economic development initiatives to help states recover from the pandemic. And I just want to note the timing on that was fortunate. Of course, the pandemic was not fortunate in that that's where this occurred from, but the timing was fortunate because the existing SEDS that was in place was due to expire near the end of 2022 already. And so we started the the new SEDS development process at the beginning of 2022. And so we were able to just plug that funding in and utilize it to get the SEDS update done in a really efficient manner and a really thorough, robust process. Next slide, please. So overview of the project team. The state of Alaska was ultimately responsible for the SEDS creation and adoption. And the state contracted with the university, as Nolan mentioned. The university really did a majority of the hands-on, like day-to-day facilitating meetings, conducting research, reviewing all the regional SEDS, providing a meta-analysis of those SEDS, drafting the report. It was a very strong partnership between the state and the university, and of course that's that benefited from the previous partnership for the previous SEDS development. There also was a strategy committee that was brought together for the SEDS process that was consisted of about 50 community and industry leaders across the state. The strategy committee served to come up with initial goals, objectives, and strategies, critique those, refine those, contribute further ideas. They had a really pivotal role in steering the SEDS development process. And then the state also partnered with regional economic development organizations. Some of you might be familiar with the term ARDers. Those are Alaska Regional Development Organizations. And then there's other regional economic development organizations that are not formally considered ARDers, but that we partnered with in developing the SEDS. And that includes like the Matsu Borough, for example. And we discussed the process with folks in the YK Delta, for example. There's not a formal ARDer in that region, but that region certainly was included and had a voice. And so that was a partnership that we wanted to include. And then one thing I wanted to add as well, so for the statewide team, Department of Commerce, I served as the grant project manager and lead point of contact here. And then John Springsteen at the governor's office also played an important role providing high level direction. Next slide, please. This slide just covers roles and responsibilities a little bit further. Probably not, I'm not going to go too in depth with this. I wanted to highlight the role that the Department of Commerce, our main focuses were on managing the grant, coordinating with those regional development organizations, identifying critical stakeholders that needed to be included, that we needed to make sure were included in the regional and industry engagement sessions, and then of course publishing the final SEDS report, whereas the university compiled a lot of the regional SEDS information, conducted all of the research, data gathering, and the facilitation. Nolan and his team were amazing throughout the whole process of facilitating all the meetings, gathering all the information and boiling it down to, so that there was no redundancy. It was just boiled down to the real meat of what came out of the SEDS process. Yeah, next slide, please. This just shows the timeline really briefly. I wanted to show the bulk of this work occurred from January 2022 through about August 2022, and the SEDS final report was published in the fall, in time, of course, to prevent a lapse in coverage for the state as far as statewide SEDS. And throughout this process, the strategy committee met in several times in the spring and summer to brainstorm and review and refine the final drafts. And most of the public outreach and input occurred between March and May. And then the public comment period, of course, occurred towards the end of this process. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an overview of what kind of representation was on the strategy committee. And I think this is important to show just because it shows that the strategy committee there was representation from many different types of organizations across the state. There was Native organization representation, members of the Alaska State Legislature, state and local government, university education, as well as K-12 education, so both levels. Of course, the regional economic development organizations, as I mentioned, business and industry representatives, as well as nonprofits. And the areas of expertise were wide-ranging across all the economic sectors in the state, all the economic drivers, big prominent economic drivers, as we all know, resource development, for example, seafood tourism, but also smaller economic drivers and areas for further development. So like intellectual property, for example, that area of expertise that spoke to the goal 2, which is emerging sectors, for example. So the full list of the strategy committee is available in the statewide SEDS document that's on the website. Next slide, please. So this slide shows why a statewide SEDS is so needed. And I know that Nolan spoke to this a little bit, but I like having a graphic, a map graphic really shows. So these are the 9 Alaska Regional Development Organizations, also known as ARDers. These entities all have at some point created a regional SEDS for their respective regions. And so a statewide SEDS is the highest umbrella, it's all encompassing. Regional SEDS are regionally focused. And then there also are tribal organizations across the state that develop a comprehensive economic development strategy as well. And some of those are in addition to these 9 ARDers. And so TCC, for example, the Tanana Chiefs Conference, they have created a SEDS before, and they cover a larger region than is shown here in the interior of Alaska. So the purpose of mentioning that is there's multiple layers. So any specific community could be covered by a regional SEDS, it could be covered by a tribal SEDS, or it could be covered by the statewide SEDS. But there are some communities that are not located in regions that have a regional development organization or a tribal organization with a SEDS. And so a statewide SEDS is really important for covering those areas, ensuring that those areas can reference the statewide SEDS if they are applying to the EDA for implementation funds for certain projects. The purpose of the robust SEDS development process is to ensure that it covers all economic issues and development issues across the state. And so projects can theoretically any project can be tied to something that's listed in the SEDS, whether it's a broad goal, more specific objective, or very specific action item. And I think that is, yeah, next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because Nolan provided a really great overview of each of the SEDS goals, but given that, again, the structure of the comprehensive economic development strategy, the strategic direction action plan within the SEDS report starts with high-level goals. We called them goal buckets during the SEDS development process. So it was these six broad goal buckets, and then within those are more specific objectives, and then within those are very specific action items. So I will go to the next slide actually and talk more specifically about the SEDS objectives. And so each of these are, so this is a listing of the SEDS objectives that came out of the SEDS development process. So as you can see, each of these color block squares is one of the broad SEDS goals. And then there were, I think 49, because it was 49 for the 49th state, it just came out that way. There were 49 objectives total. And so actually, if you click through to the next, you could advance 9 times, I think, total. There will be, so I did that's the last one. Thank you. I put little check marks here on which of the objectives had energy specific elements, energy specific action items that are pertinent to this group. So the purpose of showing this on a broad level here, and then I'll go into them in more depth in following slides, is to show the task force that energy covers all 6 of these goals. Energy is tackling energy security, energy affordability, energy reliability across the state is, it requires a very holistic approach. It touches our established industries, which are covered under Goal 1, strengthen economic engines. So that's oil and gas, that's timber. It also touches emerging sectors, industries that are a little bit more up and coming. So that includes sustainable energy as far as renewable energy development, microgrids, like integration with renewable energy, integration into microgrids. I know that's a key area, excuse me. That's a key area in the state as far as knowledge export. And then a strong business climate and entrepreneurial ecosystem that touches the university system. University research can be conducted in coordination with private investment to tackle issues that are barriers to private investment and can move both forward, which is a benefit to the state, of course. Build and update economic foundations that touches the affordability of energy, that whole issue. So the cost of energy is a well-known pain point, of course, to households, businesses, and communities in Alaska. Workforce development, that is another key factor, as came through. Nolan mentioned in the presentation, we're all aware of workforce shortages in the state. There's significant workforce needs in order to take full advantage of federal infrastructure funding coming out and available through the Infrastructure Investment Act, and workforce needed for alternative energy projects, electric vehicles, all of that work. And then lastly, building a resilient economy. Diversification and redundancy in terms of energy generation sources is critical for economic resiliency to respond to natural disasters, pandemics, all of the types of things that could come up and provide a shock to the economy. And then I also wanted to mention that while these are the objectives and action items that I highlighted for this presentation today, there are undoubtedly objectives and action items listed in the SEDS that are related to energy security that I didn't highlight for this, but doesn't mean that they aren't relevant. So I really encourage everybody to take a look at the full SEDS document and review and see if there's anything else. There's a number of action items that would play a supporting role, of course, in solving Alaska's energy issues. They might be, one step removed, for example, but addressing childcare would help with the workforce issue. Increasing the number of startups and access to capital could help fuel energy innovation and technology development. So, and lastly, I think this also shows that this is very much the guiding, one of the guiding principles behind the SEDS development process was an and, not an or approach. And so a lot of these are, focusing on oil and gas and sustainable energy, not or. For example, affordable energy across the board has been a focus. And so that's just key to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So these next slides are basically the real meat of my presentation, because I was asked to present on the energy specific objectives and action items. So in preparation for this, I went through, reviewed everything, highlighted, and then formatted this, to be visually engaging for this presentation, but where this information is pulled from is the goals and objectives detailed matrix, which is an appendix of the SEDS, of statewide SEDS. It's available on the DCCED website. One of my last slides will show you exactly how you can find that matrix. It provides some additional information that's not shown on this screen, but the purpose of the matrix is really to use it as a resource and a tool. I think it's a critical tool that I think the task force might be interested in reviewing as you're preparing the statewide energy plan. So I want to explain this a little bit further. So these objectives that are listed up at the top of the slide, objective 1.2, for example, is one of the objectives that on the previous slide, it showed 3 objectives under goal 1. So this is the first of those 3 objectives. Develop Alaska's North Slope natural gas and heavy oil for in-state and export markets. And so there were 3 action items under this objective pertinent to energy security, or the focus of this task force. And so each of the action items is listed at the top of these boxes. And then the matrix also listed potential lead entity and potential partners. And so the meaning behind these terms, it's not a directive. What it really means is that these, for the potential lead entity, these are entities that, to the best of our understanding, were either doing this work already or that we thought would be most likely to lead this action item effort. Then potential partners were suggested logical entities that would most likely assist or support the lead entity with this work. Again, based on work that's already being done, for example, or past work that those entities typically do. I think one key use for these slides and for this tool for the task force to consider is these are connections to, basically these are recommendations, potential connections to make to follow up further on any of the specific action items, and also entities that could potentially be invited for future presentations to discuss more further in more depth progress that has been completed on each of these action items since the SEDS was developed, or other ongoing work. Next slide, please. So for objective 1.5, some things that I know have already occurred on one thing I would like to say is that I'm not an expert in these specific projects, but some of these are great to look at to consider what's already occurred under some of this work. So action item, the 4th action item, for example, pursue carbon capture and sequestration. That is something that has already, some progress has already been made on that. In January of this year, the governor introduced his carbon management and monetization bill package that created statutory and regulatory structures needed to capitalize on carbon markets. And 2 pieces of this legislation included a carbon offset program and carbon capture utilization and storage program. And that has the potential to generate billions of dollars of revenue for the state over the course of the next several decades. So that's an area that essentially work is already being done on these. When these were listed in the statewide SEDS, some of these were potential projects, some of these were already ongoing projects. Many of these already have progress being made under these since they've been listed. Next slide, please. So this next slide was under the timber. This was the timber objective. And this points to opportunities for access to natural forests for both hydroelectric development, and then increasing utilization of local timber to meet in-state timber needs. I know that Southeast Conference, their regional SEDS includes objectives similar to this, because of course timber is so key to Southeast Alaska. I was just looking at their SEDS recently. They have a priority objective in their support efforts to set aside the roadless rule, for example, which is a barrier to renewable energy development. So that's an example of how the statewide SEDS and the regional SEDS really, in developing the SEDS process, we wanted to make sure that there was not, that they were complementary, not redundant, not duplicative. And I think this is an example of that. Also for the biomass needs, space heating, I think it was Steve Colt mentioned that so much focus has been on electricity and not on heating, but as we know, there's a lot of beetle-killed spruce across the state. Biomass, that's a source of biomass that can address space heating needs, which is a key issue as far as energy affordability in the state. Next slide, please. So this slide is from goal 2, which is about emerging sectors. And so these are all of the action items under objective 2.7, which this entire objective is very key to energy innovation and energy security. Develop Alaska as a global center of clean, sustainable energy innovation to grow and attract innovative firms. And some themes across here, AEA is listed as the potential lead entity on many of these, because a lot of these action items relate directly to the work that AEA does. And I really want to highlight the third from the last action item, conduct and implement a statewide strategic plan for energy development. That's exactly the work that this task force is doing right now. And I think that's a great example of how the statewide SEDS is relevant in guiding and directing and providing a roadmap for work that goes forward in the years after it's developed. Another couple items I wanted to highlight on this slide. The first action item about adopt a clean energy portfolio standard. SB 101, introduced in March, addresses this. It proposes to require utilities, rail-built utilities, to generate or purchase a specified percentage of their electricity from renewable sources, and it provides a the timeline, which 25% by 2027, 55% by 2035, and 80% by 2040. So that's exactly where this action item came from. Of course, it's just the statewide SEDS essentially captures those specific actions that were already occurring. And then hydrogen hub as well. The Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation, this is the last action item on the slide. They recently submitted a proposal, actually it was in November of 2022, to the Department of Energy for a hydrogen production hub. And that was to take advantage of bipartisan infrastructure law, or the Infrastructure Act, as we usually call it, the billions of dollars available in that act for clean hydrogen hubs to support cutting US emissions. Next slide, please. This objective utilized the assets of the University of Alaska system to grow knowledge economy firms in Alaska. So this objective is under the third goal about entrepreneurship and research and innovation. Two things I wanted to highlight on this. So the way that this action item relates to energy in my assessment when I was going through and pulling these out. So align university research with the research and development needs of economic engines and emerging sectors, especially in energy. potential lead entity, of course, University of Alaska. Some things that I know are already occurring. There was a recent presentation hosted by Commissioner Sandy of Brent Sheets, who's the director of the Petroleum Development Lab at UIF. He recently presented on a project that they are doing that is funded by the Department of Energy. And their project is focusing on core CM, which stands for carbon ore, rare earth, and critical minerals. They are working with, so the university is working with DNR, Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. So it's a university state partnership. They're focusing on like the high level goal of the project is to move the country towards rare earth element and critical mineral deployment. And the university's role is to assist alongside the private sector to address technical issues and lower the cost of development, while the private sector is basically to assist the private sector in investing in these resources and developing these resources. So that's an example of work that is that is occurring, that fits under this broad action item, and then that's a specific effort that is being undertaken. And I think that ties back to, again, the intention with the statewide SEDS is not to list very, very, very specific projects. It's to list more general projects, but it's specific enough in listing a lead entity and potential partners, where many projects that are occurring or are likely to occur in the next several years, fit under these topics. Next slide, please. So this objective, objective 4.6, this comes under the build and update. To build and update economic foundations. So this addresses the affordable energy issues. So reduce the cost of energy. The purpose of the objective is to reduce the cost of energy for industrial and residential use. And so there's many action items under this. Again, AEA across the board is listed because this comes back down to all the work, the important work that AEA does. And I don't want to read through these specifically, but I think having these listed on here and then this PowerPoint will be provided, as a reference to the task force going forward, so that you can really dive into these. But some issues that certainly are already, or some projects that are certainly already occurring under these action items. PCE, for example, the second from last action item. Senate Bill 243 was signed by the governor in July of last year in an effort to support the Alaska residents, the rural communities who utilize the power cost equalization program. That bill raised the maximum kilowatt hour reimbursement available from 500 kilowatt hours to 750 kilowatt hours per month that can be covered by PCE. Also, the Green Bank, which is just to the left of that, there is legislation that has been attempted both in 2021 and 2022. It hasn't passed the legislature yet, but that's something that will probably continue being a focus in the next several legislative sessions to create a statewide green bank. So something that would certainly be kept on the radar. Next slide, please. So goal 5 addressed, that was the goal that addressed workforce development, training, and this objective 5.9 specifically, is to prepare the Alaska workforce for job opportunities in low and no emissions energy technologies, such as electric vehicles, renewable energy systems. This action item specifically mentions the infrastructure bill and obtaining federal grants under the infrastructure bill to train mechanics and maintenance workers on electric and hydrogen vehicles. Potential partners on these projects are include the university, of course, employers, unions, training providers, etc. Next slide, please. So these last two objectives are related to goal 6, which was the resiliency goal. Leverage, this one is, leverage economic engines and emerging sectors to promote the resiliency to supply chain disruptions, natural disasters, and other external shocks. So that this mentions, again, timber resources, for example, and use in construction and biomass energy. And one specific point of progress that has been made under that, sawmill quality testing. That's a new program that is being developed under the Department of Natural Resources. It would allow Alaska sawmills to sell lumber for local construction without having to have the wood graded for quality by an outside inspector. That is something that is, I think, still related. It's one of those that might be kind of adjacent to energy security, but still related. And of course, biomass energy, it's related to the timber objective that was under goal 1. And I think I wanted to highlight that again, just to make clear the linkages between the different goals. They're not silos. It really is a web that connects together, because a lot of similar action items and projects show up under different goals, because it's all related to the general economic, large industries in the state of Alaska, and just projects that are needed to move economic project, to move everything forward. I think, yeah, next slide, please. I think there was one more slide on here. Lastly, so objective 6.3 is also under that resiliency goal, and this is talking about upgrading existing infrastructure capable of withstanding resiliency shocks. The upgrade rural energy infrastructure such as powerhouses, bulk fuel farms, that of course falls under the Alaska Energy Authority's work that they do. And then also Denali Commission does a lot of work under bulk fuel farms, for example. Deploy the last action item, deploy clean energy systems to reduce dependence on diesel fuel, including renewable and micronuclear. I think the Renewable Energy Fund, round 15 last year funded 18 projects, round 16 is currently open at the Alaska Energy Authority. So that falls squarely under this action item. And I think one other project that I'm not sure the most recent updates on the project, but I was aware of this project. I used to work at Southwest Alaska Municipal Conference, one of the ARTers. And so I knew a lot about the Nushagak electric project. They're doing a run of river concept, or they're doing they have a proposed run of river hydroelectric project that they are pursuing. And this would produce up to 12 megawatts of power, and also would provide electricity and optical fiber, like broadband fiber optic, to the communities of Dillingham, Aleknagik, Kalignik, Newstuyahok, Ekwok, and Levelock. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that one, and this refers to action item 2 on this list, is that that's an example of a project that both addresses energy security and energy affordability and renewable energy, but also redundancy and transmission lines, which is, both they go hand in hand to addressing resiliency needs in the state. Next slide, please. So that I wanted to highlight here where you can find the the rest of this information. So on our DCCED homepage, just commerce.alaska.gov, partway down the page, there's a section that mentions statewide SEDS. If you click on that, you get to this page shown here on the right. And so the first two bullets are what are probably most that I reference the most in creating this this presentation. The first bullet, of course, is the actual SEDS report itself. And also, if anybody wants a hard copy, I have hard copies at the Department of Commerce Commissioner's Office here in Anchorage. And so I could always send one of those out. It's just great to thumb through sometimes. And then Appendix A is that goals and objectives matrix. And so that is multiple pages. I also have it in Excel version if for anybody who likes to sort and work with the data that way. But that is really a key resource that I think is probably of most interest to the task force in developing these, identifying partners, projects, timeline. The goals and objectives matrix also includes potential timeline for each project and just a lot of key information there. So that's where that can be found on our website. And then next slide, please. This is my contact information if anybody wants to follow up with me later, ask any questions or wants a hard copy of the report. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Laura. That was quite the robust update on the SEDS. It was great to hear all the work that's been done on that. We do have a couple questions in the chat, but before I go to those, I really want to hit one of the key points that you talked about, and that was the timing and importance of a SEDS document. So you were mentioning that the previous SEDS was about to expire, and this funding came through at a very critical juncture to ensure that we had a new SEDS in place before the other one expired. Can you speak just more clearly to the importance of why it's important that we have active SEDS in place and what that means for potential funding opportunities for overall goals and objectives and projects that are included in the SEDS documents?
Yeah, sure. So the importance of having a SEDS in place and as far as the timing is concerned, that ties to the importance as far as accessing funding from the Economic Development Administration, which is one critical importance of having a statewide SEDS, but it's not the only one. Having a statewide SEDS is important in general, of course, for as a guiding document for economic development statewide. That is the case regardless of the timing of, that part making sure there's no lapse, it doesn't affect that part of it. The making sure there's no lapse really affects the funding of projects by the Economic Development Administration. So the EDA for any entity, whether it's a tribe, a borough, a municipality who is trying to access EDA funding to implement a project, the EDA always looks at those grant applications and looks to see if that specific project is included or can be tied to an action item or an objective located in a SEDS, whether that's a tribal SEDS, a regional SEDS, or a statewide SEDS. And so that certainly was a factor that drove the timeline of developing writing the statewide 5-year update, was making sure that we didn't have any lapse, because that could potentially negatively impact any entities in the state that are seeking EDA funding. Especially at the time last year, there was a lot of funding out there through the American Rescue Plan Act and other grants where entities across the state were applying for funding. And so we wanted to make sure that the statewide SEDS was a resource that they could utilize to reference in their grant applications.
Great, thanks a lot. Our first question comes from a task force member, Mr. Tony Izzo. He says, in objective 2.7, you show REAP as a potential partner, but not the electric utilities in the rail belt. In a similar goal in rural Alaska, you include the rural electric utilities. Why include a special interest trade organization like REAP, but not the utilities in some of the goals that were identified? And I'd have to pull up number 2.7, but could you speak a little bit more broadly about how some of the identified partners were determined? I think you spoke to it a little bit in terms of recognizing ongoing projects or at least ones on the horizon. So maybe diving into that a little bit deeper.
Yeah, certainly. And on this, I do want to get Nolan's input because the university really, with the university team really did the bulk of the facilitating meetings and gathering all of the information, projects that were mentioned in meetings that ended up becoming the objectives and the action items, and identified those potential lead entities and potential partners. So Nolan, I wonder if you could speak a little bit further to that specific objective.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of these goals and objectives that have a lot of parties that we did our best based on like the stakeholder conversations that we had, who came to the table, who was responsive, you know, in our best judgment. And we also put this out there in draft format for public comments. A lot of times the public comments catch some things like this. There's no effort to exclude any party, any, you know, rail belt utilities or anything like that. Simply didn't, probably more of an oversight than anything else. You know, when you have a document like this, you're going to have things like that. But usually we try to, people that are really concerned about things like that, usually like we catch a lot of that with a public comment period, and we did have a pretty generous public comment period. That's not one of the things that was mentioned in it. So that's the best I can do for that answer.
So to answer it on the local level, for those that don't know, I was previously a special assistant at the Fairbanks North Star Borough, and it was actually staffed to the interior ARDR. And so during our process, I was the project manager of our regional SEDS. And just like Nolan said, when we put out our draft for input, one of the most common comments we got was actually people volunteering to either be leads or partners on various projects. So we found that to be one of the most beneficial aspects of putting the comment out, or putting the draft out for comment, is to help identify those partners. But it is a challenge. There's a lot going on throughout the state, and it can be hard to ensure you're capturing everything. But I know all the teams, both locally, regionally, and at the state, or try and do their best on that one. So on that one, we do have another one. It asks, are unions part of the consulted entities? And just kind of building off the comment I just had, when at our local level, we specifically did work with the unions and did research. We have a lot of our economic development organizations, whether it's the Chamber, whether it's Fairbanks Economic Development Corp. They all have partnerships with their unions, and we did reach out and include them in our conversations. And I know that's true for a lot of the other local ARDRs as well. And in working with Nolan and his team, they really relied on our local level partnerships to help ensure that those perspectives were being shared and included as part of a statewide capacity. Nolan and Laura, I don't know if you have anything more broad you'd like to include in regards to the union's participation in the development of the SEDS.
Sure. Yeah. One thing I'll throw in is that we did have, like, through all of those listening sessions that we had, like there were definitely important union members that weighed in at a number of points in the process. We didn't systematically track them by organization type or anything like that, but there was a voice of organized labor in there to some degree. It could have been probably more systematic and brought up to the front in a better way, but that's the best answer I can provide for that.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions or hands raised at the moment, so I'll just continue on here. Since this is for the benefit of the development of a statewide energy plan, and we have task force members on here. What are some maybe low-hanging fruit items or things that you would specifically hope that the task force members take to heart and consider as part of a statewide energy plan? Is there anything easy? Well, nothing's really easy, but what are some of the more immediate things that should be looked at and tackled here as they develop that statewide plan?
Yeah, I think there's no silver bullet solutions. I think in the statewide SEDS or anywhere else. I think that the task force is looking. But I mean, I think that that probably like pushing towards what the energy transition looks like, diversifying the power source, especially for the wherever feasible, honestly. But looking at what replaces some of the like natural gas that may need to be imported at a higher cost, and like how that kind of thing, how that can be offset. That's probably one of the top places to look, I think, as far as where energy costs can be reduced. But I think that probably like the task force members would benefit a lot from taking a look at the SEDS, and especially with Laura's slides and the specific items that relate to energy, and looking through those and think about what could be incorporated into the energy specific plan, or what could be leveraged or built from. I think would be probably a smart thing to do.
Thank you. Laura, did you have anything to add to that?
I just wanted to reiterate the resource that the matrix provides, I think, in addressing some of that. And I mean, it needs to be, it's important to keep in mind that, again, this was developed towards around this time. The SEDS was finalized last year. So, of course, there's going to be some items listed in there that there's more updated information available now that wasn't captured at the time. But as far as the work that the task force is doing, I think it's important just to remember that the matrix is a resource in looking at a potential timeline for a project, potential outcomes, suggested outcomes for the project, as well as the potential lead entity and potential partners. And it could also be a resource as far as considering topics that came out of the SEDS process that might not be might be simmering out there, basically, that deserve a second look.
Thank you. We have another question from Mr. David Schaff. I think I'm probably mispronouncing that. Anyway, he asked, what would attract alternative energy companies to come to Alaska? Is there anything in the work that you found in the SEDS? Nolan, I know you spoke to some of the barriers to some issues related to energy. Is there anything that sticks out with you in the work that you've done that could be considered a barrier to alternative energy companies coming to the state?
Sure. Well, one thing I'd mention that I believe Isaac Vanderberg is part of this task force, and his organization, Launch Alaska, is all about how we can draw innovative companies to Alaska to deploy their technologies, and Alaska as an ideal test location for a lot of different technologies. A lot of varied geography, a lot of potential for wind and solar, and geothermal and hydrokinetic, and all of the list goes on. So we have a lot we're a huge test range for a lot of those kinds of technologies. I think that's probably one of the really important assets if we're talking about attracting renewable energy companies. As far as the barriers go, I think doing business in Alaska is tough on a number of fronts, depending on what space you're in. But we are an expensive location. Always the labor shortage issues, the people shortages, especially if you're talking about deployment in a place that's far from one of the major cities, and of course the cost of doing business. So I think that there's a kind of a familiar litany of barriers that we could talk about there, but I think that Alaska does have some advantages in this space as well, and people like Isaac would be able to tell you a lot about those.
Laura, did you have anything to add?
I wanted to just draw attention to one of the action items that was listed in Objective 2.7. And again, Objective 2.7 was the objective that addressed energy innovation and attracting and growing innovative firms. And so the second to last action item that I had listed on that slide addressed essentially that issue. And I don't have a status update on what, this may already be underway, but the action item, conduct a study on state level energy incentive programs across the US with a goal of expanding energy incentive programs in Alaska. So that's essentially looking at what other states are doing, how they're attracting innovative firms. And one of the potential partners listed on there is Launch Alaska. So
All right, looks like we've got another one coming in. So they're asking, sorry, I'm reading. So David is asking further on that point, like attract in what capacity, like what university programs could help keeping our K through 12 teachers, et cetera. So I think the answer to that, David, is yes, all of the above, making sure that we're addressing the quality of life issues, making sure that we have the training programs for existing workforce, making sure that we have quality housing, affordable housing. I think all of those are tied in together. And I don't know if Laura and Nolan would want to add anything on to that. Yeah. All right, folks. Well, we still got 10 minutes left, but I'm not seeing any additional questions come in. I haven't seen any other hands getting raised, so I think we'll go ahead and call this to a close. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you participation, especially to Steve and Laura and Nolan. So as a reminder, the webinar recording and the presentation slide decks will be posted on the AAA website. And please join us next week, Thursday, August 24th at 11 a.m., where we will be discussing transmission and storage, building a more resilient grid. So thank you so much and see you next week.